Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm Finlo Costain, the editor of 8.9.com. It's a very long time since bears, wolves and lynx hunted freely across the Scottish landscape, but the reintroduction of these large carnivores has been a topic of noisy debate pretty much since I can remember. On the one side of the discussion, environmentalists make the case that large carnivores would be good for ecology and tourism, while on the other, farmers oppose the idea because they've got businesses to run and it's hard enough to make a living without having to worry about a new generation of potential livestock predators in the landscape. Today, we're asking whether Scotland can make room for the lynx. Hugh Webster from Scotland The Big Picture believes that integration is possible, while Cora Cooper, an Ayrshire sheep farmer, shares the concerns of many in her industry. Hugh and Cora are with me. Welcome both. Hugh, why should Scotland make room for the lynx?
Well, obviously, I believe there are lots of reasons why Scotland should make room for the lynx, as you put it, or coexist with lynx like other countries managed to do around Europe. Rather than give you all of the reasons, I'll try and summarise with just three. Firstly, there's the economic argument that you touched on in your introduction. There's no question that lynx would be a boost to the tourism industry in Scotland. We know that from talking to tourism operators, and we know that from examples like places on Mull, where they've got data from 50 years of having sea eagles back on the west coast now, and there are various studies showing the economic benefit in terms of jobs and money brought to the island, and that has been a sustained interest. It's not been a peak that's faded away. It continues to attract people there. And we also know it from Europe with examples with lynx, where you can look at Germany in the Harz Mountains, where lynx have recently been reintroduced, and studies there show that about half of the people who visit the Harz Mountains do so partly because lynx are there. It's one of the main reasons that they visit the area. And that lynx tourism is thought to be worth between £7 and £11 million a year to the region. So there's the economic reasons. I can talk about ecological reasons as well. I suspect you want to touch on that more later, so I'll just briefly say lynx are an apex predator, and bringing back an apex predator, which we don't have at the moment here in Scotland, would restore a host of natural processes which are either missing completely or sadly inhibited in their current state. And the third reason, which in many ways for me I think is the most important, the experiential and emotional benefits that we would get from having this missing species back in our landscape. A lot of people really feel the depletion of our native biodiversity, the loss of our natural heritage, and lynx would make a difference to that. And most sort of profoundly, they would make Scotland feel wilder. And I think that that is something that people really miss at the moment. They feel they have to travel abroad to experience that. And lynx would make a difference to making Scotland a wilder place.
Thanks, Hugh. That's a really interesting summary and a good way to get us started. And we'll come into some of those in more detail as we go forward. Cora, how do you feel about the idea of sharing your farm with the lynx?
I mean, I have huge concerns about sharing our farm with the lynx, and as a farmer with real practical on the ground experience of the current conditions today in Scotland, I think that there's so much that we still have to do and can do before we can consider bringing in another species. And I think we've got so much here in Scotland to be proud of, but that also needs more support. And as a country, we should be playing to our strengths when heather moorland is rarer than rainforests, and we have so many struggling native species who can still bring that emotion to people, like the curlew, black grouse, capercaillie, who we know need more help and more support. And I feel that we should be enhancing and improving what we have first before we start looking at bringing in another species and looking at what we can do and is actionable today to improve biodiversity and nature recovery in Scotland.
Cora, tell us about your farm. We've talked a bit about your idea of farming and some of your concerns, but just give us a sort of sense of who you are as a farmer, the number of hectares that you look after, the number of sheep you have, where you are in Scotland, that sort of thing.
So I am a first generation landowner in East Ayrshire, Scotland. I farm and own 2,000 hectares, and we run 3,500 Herdwick and Welsh Mountain sheep. Over 85% of our farm is in a special protection area and site of special scientific interest. The land ranges from 800 to 2,000 feet above sea level. The majority of the land is classed as Region 3 in Scotland, which is really rough hill grazing land. We've got a variety of land types across the farm. We've got species-rich grassland, we've got heather moorland, we've got restored peatland, we've got silver pasture, we've got multiple ponds, we've got multiple rivers and streams, and we use holistic management to optimize everything that we have, both for nature and our sheep farming system. And as someone who spends most days outside on our farm, I really view our hills as an intricate web of ecosystems teeming with life, and I see sheep as a vital thread of this web. And sorry, the dogs are
Don't worry about
barking.
them. That's fine. Just start that sentence again, will you?
Yeah. Sorry, I've lost my thought. I see our hills as an intricate web of ecosystems teeming with life, and sheep are a vital thread of this web. And even when I look at, this time of year on the farm, it's a beautiful time on the farm. Everything's starting to burst into life. We've got the clover coming through the grass. We've got the nesting wader birds who have returned, and the hills are echoing with the sounds of the curlew and the lapwing. And it's just, the bees are buzzing. I really see our system as incredibly integrated with nature, but effectively our system could not exist without nature, because in order for the grass to grow, I need the sun to shine and the rain to fall, and I cannot control either of these things. So it's in my best interest to have the land in the best health that it can possibly be.
Fantastic. That's a really lovely description of your farm. And Hugh, we're talking there about, a family-owned business that's responsible for managing 2,000 hectares of land. That's what, about 5,000 acres of really diverse farmland, with 3,500 ewes up there, and then obviously lambs when they come along as well. Really, in the lower mountain region, but definitely mountainous, when we're talking about 2,000 feet above sea level, integrated with nature, dependent on the sun's energy. This is a description of Scotland's ecology and microcosm. And this conversation is taking place because you wrote an article for the Times headlined "Sheep are a costly burden on the Scottish landscape." And I know that headline wasn't yours, but is that essentially what you think?
No, you're right. The headline was not mine. Absolutely wasn't my choice. Protested against it, but the Times insisted on sticking with it. The reason I wasn't happy with the headline is because I felt it didn't reflect the nuance that I tried to portray in the article. I live in Highland Perthshire, surrounded by lots of sheep, and so I do understand the importance of sheep to rural communities. But at the same time, I think that there are important and valid questions to be asked about how many sheep we have in Scotland, and whether sustaining high sheep densities should always be our top priority. Because we have to recognise a couple of things. We have more sheep in Scotland than most countries, both in terms of absolute numbers and in terms of sheep densities. And we also have less nature. We're one of the most nature depleted, nature impoverished countries in the world. So it is a fact that whilst sheep can be part of a healthy landscape, as described beautifully by Cora, and I don't doubt that there's all sorts of amazing things going on her farm, there are also sometimes environmental costs associated with sheep, and that can be related to overgrazing, or it can just be opportunity costs. If you have sheep, you haven't got some of the other things that we need, and we know that we need more woodland. We don't meet our current timber needs as it stands, and yet we are an exporter of sheep. So we don't eat all the sheep that we produce. We're net exporters. So why are we using land to export something that we have a surplus of when we have a lack of other things? And one of those things that we really lack in this country is nature. And it particularly concerns me when you hear the narrative that is developing around sea eagles. We hear a lot in the news about seagulls taking lambs and how shocking that is for farmers. And sometimes we hear that some farmers are struggling to stay in business because of conflict with seagulls. And it is a very short jump from there to saying we can't have seagulls and sheep. It's being presented as an either or situation. And we've been there before, right? We know that one of the main reasons that seagulls went extinct in Scotland was because of conflict with livestock interests. And the same narrative is beginning to play out with lynx. We're talking about whether we could reintroduce lynx to Scotland. The majority of the public, Scottish public, want to see lynx reintroduced, but farmers, quite understandably, totally fairly, have concerns about that. And yet we're in a situation where the possibility that lynx could, and they likely will, kill some sheep, but it would be a relatively small number of sheep when you talk about 6 million sheep in Scotland. The possibility that lynx might kill some sheep is being held up as a reason that we cannot reintroduce this missing species, which offers all of these benefits, which we've talked about. So that worries me, and I'm not sure that we have the balance right between sheep farming and nature restoration in Scotland.
Well, I'm tempted to just ask you to respond to that immediately, with any thoughts that you have around the things that Hugh's been saying there.
I think that there is a lot that we need to do in Scotland towards nature recovery. However, I think there's quite a lot that we could improve on and that we need to do in order to solve the crisis that Scotland finds itself in just now, before we can consider bringing a new species in, which really, until it happens, we're not entirely sure of the consequences, and we won't fully understand that until it's done. And when I look on our farm, where we've done over 800 hectares of peatland restoration, let's not forget that not so long ago, people were being paid to dig ditches in that peatland, which then caused the problem that we've been seeing in erosion of peatlands and the carbon loss that creates. So I think that we can find a way, and I understand that peatland restoration is an entirely different subject to lynx reintroduction. But when I look at the peatland restoration, which we've done on our farm, we integrated it so that it benefits the ecological health of the land, but it also improved the efficiency and the productivity of our sheep farming system. And it didn't have to be food production or nature recovery. And I think that that's where I am categorically not against nature recovery. I'm just not convinced that lynx is the only answer. And I think we've got a lot of work to do first before we can consider lynx.
Cora, I wanted you to talk to me a little bit about the positive sort of ecological and economic benefits that you think are associated with sheep, particularly on your farm. But before I do, I just want to sort of, think back to what Hugh was saying there, because he was recognizing that there are probably, some sheep farms where you're getting really good ecological outcomes at the same time as reflecting this sort of commonly held view that sheep are associated with overgrazing. This is a view that, Guardian readers in particular might have come across quite frequently from the columnist George Monbiot, who often sort of talks about denuded, sort of sheep denuded uplands where there's been an awful lot of overgrazing. And, and to be fair, there are places where there has been a lot of overgrazing. So let's think of the positives, because if your farm is an exemplar of the good that can be done with sheep, then clearly we need to understand that so that perhaps we can think about, broadening that positive impact.
So I think it's important to note, first off, that since the start of our flock, it has always been entirely pasture grazed system. We give no supplementary feed. We don't make silage. We don't make hay. We don't top grass. The sheep grazing is the sole way we have of optimizing our grasslands. And we use adaptive mob rotational grazing to graze the land. So we're looking at mob sizes. The largest mob would be 1,800 ewes, and the smallest mob would be 1,600 ewes. The paddock sizes vary greatly. So in-by would be up to kind of 25 acres, and hill paddocks would be from 25 acres to 700 acres. And the idea around this adaptive mob rotational grazing is that it depends on the mob size, the paddock size, the weather conditions, and the grass. So you're really utilising your tool and your knowledge of the land as a land manager to do what's best. So you're looking to kind of eat a third and trample a third and leave a third. So we use our grazing as kind of the main tool we have of managing the health and well-being of our land, which, like I say, the majority of it is in a special protection area. But also, before we bought the land historically had quite a low stocking density. And we've seen that as we've increased our stocking density using these holistic measures, we've also seen the nature thrive and a boost to the biodiversity of the species on the farm.
So a lot of people listening to the podcast, and I think an increasing number of people within the environmental movement more broadly, within society more broadly, will have come across the idea of cattle mob grazing, the idea of adaptive multi-paddock grazing, where you can get remarkable environmental outcomes from using cattle to do as you say, where they're eating a third, they're trampling a third, and they're then leaving a third and then moving on. But for a lot of people, the idea of getting this from sheep, another kind of ruminant, I think is quite new. And so I think you can help us understand the way that you're managing your sheep, perhaps, to deliver that adaptive mob rotational grazing that you're talking about. So when you've got one of those mobs, if we think about set stocking, we might expect those sheep to be on the hillside for quite a long time before they move on, or to be there and then choose when they move on themselves. What is it for you? How long are the sheep there? I mean, clearly it's adaptive, but to give us some idea of the range.
So again, it isn't entirely adaptive. So we, in some occasions, it could be half a day. On the larger hill paddocks, it could potentially be up to 2 weeks, but entirely depends on the land, the sheep, and the weather. And we also have blocks which we keep for deferred grazing for the winter to allow flowering species the opportunity to shine throughout the summer. So, and these dogs are really barking because they can hear the quads outside and they want to be outside. Sorry.
But from my perspective, it's not an issue. If there's a little bit of barking in the background, it's nowhere near as loud for me as it is for you, I suspect, Cora. So if you're okay, if you're okay to continue, that's not an issue. Okay.
And I think it's also important to note that we credit the success of our peatland restoration and the ongoing management of it to, in part, this adaptive mob rotational grazing that we have. And we grazed our peatland restoration before, during, and after the restoration. And the land bounced back so quickly after having those big heavy machines in. The land bounced back after 6 months. And we know that peatland can store more carbon than all the trees in the world. And we know that we have degraded peat in Scotland. So to me, we need to be focusing on the carbon lock that we can get from having healthy peatland, and also the role that grazing sheep can play in that.
When you talk about adaptive mob rotational grazing and some of the insights that you've given us there, and you talk about the way in which the land that you have has never been ploughed, it's never been planted, it's just, it is what it is. Clearly there we are getting significant carbon capture, and not just capture, but that carbon is being held in the land, which is really important. Not just the peatland, but the soil more generally. You're likely, through that adaptive grazing to be having significantly better water flows, water management, airflow, nutrient flow, and the biodiversity should be increasing. I wonder, from an anecdotal perspective, Cora, if you could just talk to us about some of the wildlife that you see, some of the biodiversity outcomes that you would associate with the type of grazing that you've been doing.
So we have a kind of variety in the structure of our grass. We've got some shorter grass, we've got some longer grass, we've got a lot of flowering species. The cuckoo flowers are out just now. We can see that the marsh orchids are kind of starting to you can see that something's starting to come through. In the summer, we'll have a lot of kind of harebells, meadow sweet, eyebright, wild thyme, the heather. We have great numbers of dung beetles, which is really exciting to see. We have really good wader bird densities on the farm, and actually this year we're really excited to see that we have even more nesting curlew, which is a fantastic thing. And I really think that, as a farmer and a land manager, nothing fills me with joy more than when I'm out on the hill and you hear that haunting call of the curlew echoing around the hills. You see the lapwing. It's fantastic. We've got lots of buzzards this year. We've been quite excited to see red kites come in. We always have wild ducks and heron at the multiple ponds that we have in different sectors of the farm. Just now the hills are literally alive with skylark and meadow pipit, so it's a beautiful, really beautiful time on the farm. And I think as someone, like I said before, who spends the majority of their time outside, what I'm seeing is giving me real positivity and hope for the future and what Scotland can deliver through effective land management.
Yeah, it's really exciting to hear, the sorts of things that you're seeing, the range of flowers and the range of birds there. And I live down in rural Dorset where, you would expect to see an awful lot of those things. And I suspect that you've got a greater variety of insect life, of plants and birds than we see down here, which is quite thrilling. The last thing I wanted to ask you about before I go back to Hugh, because this is something that Hugh raised, was around forestry. And clearly we know, as a country, as a UK nation, that we only produce about 20% of the timber that we use in this country, and that we clearly need to increase the amount of trees that we have, the amount of timber that we're producing, partly from a carbon capture perspective, but also just from a pure timber use perspective. Now, you talked about having silvopasture on your land, and I think there's a little bit of forestry there as well. But as I understand it, there are restrictions that stop you from being able to plant that much more. And I just wonder if you could talk us through what you have and some of the restrictions so that Hugh's aware.
So first off, I think it's important to note that we have got thousands of established trees across the farm in different areas. But on our land, which is in the SPA and the SSSI, which is over 85%, we would be prohibited from planting on that land. I think that we could possibly get derogations for shelter belts and small scale plantations, but in terms of our actual viable land, which we could plant with trees, there's probably only about 10% of that 2,000 hectares which would be plantable. But, and I think this is a really important point, we need that most productive part of the farm in order to be able to carry the full weight of that hill, because there's maximum output and there's maximum sustainable output. We as a business are striving for maximum sustainable output. But for example, our natural twins, which occur in our flock, we are aiming for a single lamb, but there will always be natural twins. And that will obviously be a much greater stress on the ewe. It will require her to eat more. That ewe will come down to this very limited, more productive ground of ours. And also that is essential, that grassland management, so that we do not have to give supplementary feed. And I think what we've really tried to do with our business is create a resilient and robust flock that can be as unimpacted by global markets as possible. So we have no feed costs, we have no electricity costs, we rely on incredibly minimal medicine. So we've got as healthy and robust a flock as possible. And that's another key point on this rotational grazing, is we are using this rotation to manage the parasite load, which also means we're not worming our ewes, which then that's going to impact the soil health and have healthy consequences on the soil biology.
Hugh, you've heard what Cora's been saying there, talking about her farm and the ecological outcomes associated with that on, on a commercial sheep farm. And you've been sitting very patiently listening, but I thought it was important for Cora to be able to sort of outline, the work that she's doing and some of the outcomes that she's achieving. Is that a surprise to you? Is that a different story to the one that you're used to hearing about sheep farming?
I mean, it's great to hear about all of the steps that Cora's putting in place to produce sheep in the most sustainable way that she is able to. But I think we have to be frank about the fact that that isn't representative of sheep farming across most of Scotland. I think that is probably the exception rather than the rule, certainly in terms of no inputs, no supplementary feeding, no silage, limited worm treatments, all of those things. Most sheep are having all of those things added to them. So it's not a surprise to me that some people are doing it, but my question is the industry as a whole, these overall impacts, the large numbers of sheep. And Cora talked about how she's prevented from planting trees in some of these SPAs and triple SIs. And that's fair enough. These are valuable habitats. But we have to recognise that there are other valuable upland habitats that are massively reduced in their extent and distribution at the moment, such as the sort of mountainous woodland belt that we should have, the montane willows and all of those things. So they don't necessarily need to be planted, but they need to be given an opportunity to be freed from grazing. And if there isn't a seed source nearby, then you will need to start planting these things. So we have to recognise the huge amounts of habitat that we are missing. And we can talk about this whole sort of heather moorland is rarer than rainforest thing, and I think that there have been various efforts to sort of critique that claim and sort of examine it, that people can look up online. But what we know we are missing is a lot of this montane woodland, and that is largely because of overgrazing. And whether that requires actual planting or whether that just means fencing stock out and deer, it's both, right? It's not just deer, it's not just sheep, but we can't address these issues of overgrazing without looking at both. And there's a lot of effort going on at the moment to control deer numbers in Scotland and to try and reduce them to sort of target densities in various areas. But that's going to have limited impact if we're not also able to think about sheep grazing and allowing woodland regeneration and peatland restoration. Because sounds like Cora's doing brilliant stuff with her peatlands, but the reality is that most of the peatlands across Scotland are in a poor state, and our peatlands should be a huge carbon store, but they're actually calculated to be emitting carbon at the moment nationwide, and largely that is because of overgrazing. So I think, yes, there are undoubtedly examples of good practice, and I wish there were more of them, but the big picture is that there are problems.
Cora, I just want to come back to you very briefly, and I wonder if you would reflect, because I want to stay with Hugh for a little while, but could you just reflect in 30 seconds on what Hugh's saying there about the idea of your farm being different from the norm in terms of sheep farms? Do you feel that you're an exemplar? Do you feel that what you're doing and the ecological outcomes that you're achieving are different to the majority of sheep farms across Scotland, or do you think that that's a misrepresentation?
I think that there are good and bad examples of practice within any industry and any sector. There will always be good and bad examples. But I think fundamentally it is in a farmer's best interest to have a resilient and robust landscape in order to be able to continue to produce their product. So I really do think that a farmer cares the most about the health and well-being of their land. And I think we really need to be careful here that we do not devalue the small steps that every individual person can take that together can make a great action and a great positive in climate change mitigation and biodiversity.
So I'm going to take it from your answer, and maybe this is cheeky of me. I'm taking it from your answer that you agree to an extent that what you're doing is a bit different to what a lot of the sheep industry is doing. And what you said there was that there are examples of good practice and there are examples of less good practice, and that, you know, in the perfect world, we would see a better integration, a really full integration between ecology and sheep management in the way that you're trying to deliver there. And I guess my question, therefore, back to you, Hugh, is do you think it's any more unreasonable to expect that the type of practice that Cora is employing on her land is extended, whether that's through choice because it's better business or through government incentives, that is extended across sheep farming more broadly across Scotland? Then is that any more unreasonable than the idea of reintroducing the lynx?
I'm not sure that I understand the question in terms of the how the two things are comparable.
Well, you want to have the lynx reintroduced, and there is a view amongst sheep farmers, I guess, that is an unreasonable thing. From your perspective, you're making the argument that that sheep farming isn't as ecologically sound as it could be, and so what I'm asking is whether, you know, whether one is more unreasonable as a position than the other.
I guess it's about justifying these demands, right? So if you want to term them like that, as demands or requests, wishes, if you like, a wish list. So the justification for bringing back lynx, all those economic, ecological, experiential, emotional reasons, all those benefits, and that's why I and many like me think that it would be a good idea to bring back lynx, and why, despite the fact that it would create some challenges for some people, I think those can be managed and people can be helped to live with them. So I guess the question would then be, what if we are saying, well, let's try and shift sheep farming in a direction where more farmers are using fewer inputs and using breeds where maybe they produce a single lamb and rather than two, and less impact on the land, and use these techniques like mob grazing and all of that, that can help sustain more nature and reduce the environmental costs and impacts that we know can be associated with sheep farming. I guess my question is, what is the cost to farmers of doing that? Why is that? And are we talking about a reduction in profit? Are we talking about sort of just a shift in traditions? I don't know what the barriers are to why that isn't more common, and why we don't see more of that sort of sheep farming, and we see so much of the sort that we do.
Maybe Cora, you can come back on that, not right now, but in a little while. And I mean, for me, I suspect that a lot of it is to do with habit and the way that, you know, things have evolved over the last few decades. That there has been an ever greater reliance, not just in sheep farming, but in farming across the board on these inputs. And the farmers that are managing to reduce their inputs are also managing to reduce their costs, and as a result of becoming more profitable at the same time as integrating with nature. But Hugh, having heard about the way that Cora farms, do you think it's possible for a lynx family to coexist in that landscape with her sheep?
I've got no doubt in my mind that a lynx family could coexist in that landscape. I guess the question would be whether Cora and her sheep could coexist with the lynx, and that is, there's no simple answer to that. That is a complicated topic, because there are all these. The key question is predation, right? When we're talking about the conflict that can exist between sheep farming and lynx, what we're basically talking about is the risk that lynx can sometimes kill some sheep. And there are various things that influence that risk. one of the things is sheep density. The more sheep you have, then the higher the risk of a lynx attack. Another factor is lynx density. So the more lynx you have, understandably, the greater risk that some of those lynx might attack sheep at some point. But the sort of the key things that affect whether the most important things that affect whether lynx attack sheep from research around Europe, we know that the foolproof way that you can avoid having your sheep attacked by predators, not just lynx, is to have a shepherd with them around the clock, right? There's countries like Romania and in parts of the Alps where shepherds stay with their sheep literally around the clock. That tradition has long since died out in Scotland, and I don't know if it will ever come back. Interestingly, in Switzerland, since the return of lynx, and particularly since the return of wolves, lynx were reintroduced in Switzerland. Wolves made their own way back to Switzerland, but they have actually restarted that tradition in Switzerland, and there's a shepherding school now where people are relearning those old skills. So it's not that it can't happen, but I've spoken to farmers in Scotland who are extremely sceptical about whether that is likely in Scotland. So make of that what you will. But there are other things which are relatively straightforward, which can reduce that risk of an attack. The main thing is keeping sheep out of woodland. The country that sees the highest rate of recorded lynx attacks on sheep is Norway, where the sheep are just left roaming the woods, the extensive forest, all throughout the summer without anybody checking on them, and the sheep becoming highly dispersed. And they are vulnerable to lynx in those woodland habitats. Whereas next door in Sweden, where they keep their sheep fenced in fields, they have many more lynx and far, far, far fewer, orders of magnitude fewer attacks. And even in Norway, within what they call the lynx management zones, where farmers have started to shift their sheep out of the forest and keep them in fenced pastures, they see very, very few attacks. So there are some sort of fairly basic things you can do that can reduce that risk of attack, that I think Cora should be able to manage that risk at an acceptable level, and then systems have to be put in place to help farmers to cope on the occasions that predation still does occur.
We're going to come on and we're going to talk about how to manage some of those risks in a little while. But before we do, I just wonder if you could talk us through the type of habitat that is, common for a lynx. What does a lynx like in terms of habitat?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it's a woodland animal, and that is where their preferred prey, roe deer, often found. Although you talk to some roe deer specialists and they'll tell you roe deer are happy to live anywhere. You find them on the fringes of city environments, you find them in beaches, but woodlands are important for lynx. But it's not that they need uninterrupted expanses of wilderness forest, and that is a sort of misconception that is increasingly being challenged by the data that we're seeing coming out of Europe. Lynx certainly did retreat to these woodland tracts that were left in Europe, but now that the lynx population is increasing, they're increasingly spreading out into more mixed environments, peri-urban environments, agricultural environments that have quite fragmented and quite small amounts of woodland. On the outskirts of Hearts, there are lynx that have existed and thrived in landscape with similar amounts of forest that we have here in Scotland. In Switzerland, they're seeing them move out of the Jura mountains and out of the Alps and onto the plateau in the middle of Switzerland. So they're more tolerant of more human-dominated landscapes than we thought historically. But woodlands are important for them as a refuge. They need somewhere where they can get away from humans in the daytime, somewhere to rest up. But it's not that they are exclusively confined to woodlands. They can move between woodlands, and at certain times of year, they will move out of woodlands to hunt.
It's interesting. I wonder the degree to which that's by choice rather than necessity, because of course, there are animals, for example, the fox in the UK that thrives in an urban environment, but then there are other wild animals that are kind of more forced into those peri-urban settings because there simply isn't the habitat that they really like. And I'm aware, Hugh, that the lynx died out somewhere between the 11th and 17th centuries in Scotland, partly due to habitat loss and in particular deforestation. And there is now even less woodland in Scotland than there was then. Obviously, there was this great sort of period of deforestation when timber being used in ships in particular. But it's continued, and yeah, there has been some restoration of woodland in Scotland. But what makes you think that the lynx would actually benefit, that it would like living in Scotland?
Yeah, firstly, I'm not sure about that claim that there's less woodland today than there was when the lynx went extinct. We don't know, as you rightly say, there's a broad window when we know that the lynx disappeared, but pinning it down to even
But there
the
has
last
been
century is difficult.
deforestation, hasn't there, across
There has
that
been
whole
deforestation,
period?
but that reached its lowest level at the start of the 20th century, after the lynx went extinct. But even by the time the Romans arrived in Scotland, Scotland had lost half its forests. And when you talk about the sort of building of the great Michael, that warship in the 15th century, or 1505, I think it was, 16th century, the chronicles at the time talk about how the woods of Scotland were emptied to provide the timber for that warship. And when people have done analysis of the timbers in places like Fife at the time, that date from that period, it shows that Scotland was already having to import most of its timber from Scandinavia and France. So deforestation had reached an advanced stage already by that point. So I think you read some people say that we've got more woodland today, even though we've got much less than the rest of Europe. We've got more woodland today than at any point in the last 1,000 years. So I don't think it's that woodland is a critical factor for lynx anymore. I suspect what probably drove the lynx to extinction at the point when it did disappear from the United Kingdom and the British Isles was probably loss of its prey base as much as loss of habitat. Habitat is important, as we talked about, as a refuge, but we know that species, the roe deer, the lynx's preferred prey, almost went extinct. It's hard to imagine today when we have so many deer, but it did almost go extinct in the British Isles. And in places like Wales, it's only started to make a recovery relatively recently. So I suspect it was as much to do with loss of its prey base as it was habitat loss. And added to that, you had people much more sort of evenly distributed across the landscape historically, and there would have been an element of direct persecution of these cats as they had less and less habitat and less prey. And as they had less prey, we know that the less wild prey that lynx have access to, the more likely they are to take livestock, and that would have increased that risk of persecution.
Do you have a sense, Hugh, of, Scotland is a big place, and the geography differs greatly between Ayrshire, where Cora lives, and the Scottish Highlands. And obviously in the Scottish Highlands, there's been an awful lot of work to start reforesting, the hills there, particularly in the bottom third of hills. Lots and lots of planting going on, and really quite established woodland now. Do you think that it's likely, if we were in a position where the lynx was being reintroduced, presumably it would be more likely the highlands than the lowlands? And if there was a lot more woodland, do you think that the lynx would stay there, or would they still be moving outside of the woodland areas?
Um, I, I think is a project looking at reintroducing lynx to northern England. And there is a project that is looking at reintroducing lynx to the Highlands. And I don't know that those are going to be separate applications. I don't know which is likely to, more or less likely. I can't really comment on that. In terms of where lynx might move to, there's been lots of academic studies looking at habitat suitability and the extent of woodland networks, the connection between them, and the availability of suitable habitat related to that. And they suggest that the north of Scotland could support a larger population of lynx than the south of Scotland, but it is unlikely that the two populations would meet, that the sort of central belt with all of the development and roads and infrastructure, that would likely be a sort of uncrossable barrier for lynx. They are quite good at dispersing. Wolves are sort of your ultimate dispersing animal. They're incredible dispersers. Bears are the worst at dispersing out of your European large carnivores. Lynx sit somewhere in the middle, and they can cross things that you might imagine they wouldn't be able to. There's a record of a lynx crossing the Rhine where it was 400 meters wide, for example. So they are able to cross quite significant barriers, and an individual road is unlikely to be a major barrier, although more of a barrier, interestingly, to females than males. But the central belt is thought to be probably too great a barrier. So if lynx were reintroduced either to south or the north of Scotland, it wouldn't mean that they spread across the rest of the country.
I'm interested because we're talking about the idea, or you talked earlier on about the idea of apex predators and the benefits that they can bring, and a lot of people will be familiar with the idea of the way that wolves have changed the shape of the river, for example, in Yellowstone. What are the ecological benefits of the lynx?
Yeah, so there's a lot of controversy, isn't there, about this, the story about wolves changing rivers in Yellowstone, and the science is not absolutely categorical. I don't think so. We have to treat that with caution. There's undoubtedly lynx would have some ecological benefits, and that's mostly due to them restarting these missing or inhibited natural processes I talked about. So bringing back an apex predator could reduce deer numbers in local areas. It's not going to reduce deer numbers across the whole of Scotland, but where you've got reasonable numbers of lynx, once if we were to reintroduce lynx and if the population reached a reasonable number over time, then the experience from Europe tells us that lynx can have an impact on prey numbers. And that obviously has benefits in terms of woodland regeneration. Also has benefits in terms of things like nutrient cycling. Lynx, when they kill a deer, that deer stays in the environment. It isn't removed from the environment, which we know does have an ecological impact when we're talking about constantly taking red deer off the hill, for example. And that in turn benefits all of the sort of necrobiome, the scavengers, the species that can benefit from having these carcasses in the environment. And it can also help promote woodland restoration because you get this sort of trampling effect around carcasses, breaks down the understory layer in the forest, adds a whole load of nutrients, and helps saplings to emerge out of that they might otherwise struggle. So there are these sort of various ecological benefits. But I also want to stress that lynx are not a silver bullet for solving all of Scotland's ecological problems. They would help with some things. They would be a benefit, but I think we have to be careful about always asking that question: what are the ecological benefits of this and that? And no one is asking what is the ecological benefit of conserving curlews or lapwings. We just value curlews and lapwings because they enhance our lives. We love to see them, we love to hear them. And it's the same with lynx, right? We value lynx and we want them back because we think our lives would be richer with them.
So, Cora, you've heard a lot of what Hugh said there, and I'm sure there are things that you'd like to come back on. But just in basic terms, you're in favour of integrating nature on your farm, and you manage your sheep to deliver the strong ecological outcomes that we've talked about. Surely, if there is a sheep farmer in Scotland that would welcome the reintroduction of the lynx, it ought to be you. So why aren't you there? Kind of drumming, sort of banging the drum for the lynx to be reintroduced as part of biodiversity, part of nature. What's putting you off? Is it a fear of the unknown, or are there specific concerns that you have?
I have specific concerns, again, from my experience of someone who's out in the land and sees just how fragile the balance is right now, that we are essentially bringing in an unknown, because although there's studies and we can look to other countries who have introduced lynx to see how it's played out there, the reality is Scotland is its own landscape and it's got its own particular set of circumstances, and we won't fully understand the true impact until we do it. And I also wanted to touch on Hugh's point of the methods that farmers can undertake to protect their livestock. It's really important to mention, whether I am with the flock all the time or I've put certain measures in place, I am still getting the same price for my lamb regardless. So if the onus is on the farmer to undertake these enhanced measures of livestock protection, where does the funding come for that? Because ultimately, the lamb is the exact same price regardless. So who is to absorb the cost and the impact of these enhanced measures? And I think, for me, obviously predation is a huge concern, and I don't think we can fully understand what that will be in Scotland until it actually happens. And I think we're already seeing in Scotland kind of the knock-on effect of the introduction of apex predators and the lack of farmers' ability to control them. And then in some of these countries where these animals have been successfully introduced, there is an ability to control problem animals, whereas we already have situations in Scotland that are not resolved, and adding another potential problem into the mix could just exacerbate losses. And I think it's my main concern is what the impact will be to the delicate balance that we have. And I don't think we're actually doing enough right now to protect the likes of lapwing and curlew from predators. And I think that there's so much more that could be done for black grouse, for capercaillie. I think we should really focus on what's here right now and struggling before we consider the thought of bringing essentially an unknown in to what's already quite a damaged system.
And I guess that's part of the point, Hugh, isn't it? That it is, it's a system that has been managed and it has been damaged by humans. And, we're only now sort of at the beginning of a journey to restore some of that balance. And so I guess the question is, Cora's raised the issue of predation there. This is your chance to kind of start to change her mind. And I wonder if you have suggestions for the ways that she and the government and the funding system and society more broadly might deal with that issue of possible predation. And just before you do, we've been talking a long time. Are you both okay to talk for another sort of 15-20 minutes? Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. So just to lead you into that question again, Hugh, so how do we deal with possible predation?
I mean, Cora raised a lot of issues there, and one of the things she talked about as being a real major concern for her was the balance of nature and the threats to what we already have. I think it's really important to point out that there's no evidence that lynx have caused a decrease or a decline or a problem for any of these species that Cora is talking about anywhere where they have recovered. And in fact, we know that in some places it has been the opposite. So when we're talking about, we shouldn't reintroduce lynx because it might be a problem for some of our existing nature, which, by the way, continues to decline in some cases like the capercaillie with all our existing efforts. We know that where lynx have recovered in Scandinavia, they have seen increases in black grouse, increases in mountain hare, increases in capercaillie, and that has been directly attributed to the recovery of the lynx, because lynx, after roe deer, one of the most common items in their diet are red foxes. And when lynxes eat a lot of red foxes, it reduces the overall predation pressure. Even though a lynx might occasionally take a black grouse or a capercaillie, it is taking more foxes and the overall predation pressure is reduced on those species. So there's this sort of instinct to be really cautious with our existing wildlife and to try and manage our way out of trouble. But that really, the evidence is that's not serving us particularly well. And lynx do that job and have done that job naturally for millennia and do it better than we can. So that would be my response to Cora's concerns about the natural balance. When you're talking about the predation problem for farmers, and Cora talked about, I'm only going to get the same amount of money for my lamb whether I put in protection measures or not. I guess there's a couple of things I could say about that. One is that there are various schemes around the world where people have attempted to develop these predator-friendly brands. So if you're able as a sheep farm to say, look, I'm a sheep farmer that lives with lynx, coexists with lynx, therefore my lamb is lynx-friendly lamb, or indeed you could talk about lynx-friendly wool, it provides a marketing opportunity to separate yourself from the crowd, right? It's a premium product. It's lynx friendly, and therefore someone who is interested in conservation and support the lynx is more likely to pay a bit more for that lamb. If you're not convinced by that, the other opportunity that is out there and is used in some countries is to pay farmers a coexistence payment, effectively, basically to say, look, we recognize that there are costs involved in coexisting with a large predator. Some of those costs might be the protection levels that you put in place. Some of it might be just in terms of added stresses and added labor costs, those sorts of things. So some countries like Sweden, they will pay people a set rate where they say, to thank you for having this species, which we as a society value and we want to have back, but we recognize that you, as one part of society, bear the majority of the costs that having that animal around. We're going to offset those costs by paying you, sometimes called ecosystem service payments or conservation payments. But basically, it's just a added payment to the farmer that says, we recognize there are costs, and therefore to make it beneficial to you to have this animal around that the rest of us really value, we're going to pay you some money towards doing that.
Are you able to give us any live examples of that? How those might work? I mean, for example, are they a per lamb cost, or a cost that's just sort of paid out as a grant on an annual basis as a maintenance payment? And do you have any idea of the levels that have been tested?
So it's unfortunately it's quite a rare system, because what often farmers push for instead is direct compensation. They say if we lose an animal, we want to be paid for that animal. But that system is actually fraught with all sorts of problems that don't serve anybody. Farmers complain because they may not get the full value of the animal, and even if they do, it doesn't reflect all the other costs that are involved when livestock are lost. There are also issues with verifying losses. So sometimes some systems, like in Norway, they don't really verify many of the claimed losses, and that leads to a system where Norwegian researchers believe that the number of livestock that are claimed lost in Norway massively exaggerate the true level of losses. But then you can go to the other extreme, if you like, and have really stringent levels of verification where you have to produce a carcass with evidence that it was a lynx that killed that sheep or lamb. And that's just not possible a lot of the time. Sometimes the lynx just disappears with a lamb, and you've just lost a lamb and you can't say where it's gone. Or a problem that there is an emerging problem in the Alps is that they've got a recovering vulture population there. And so the carcasses are rapidly being dismantled by vultures, and it's impossible to do a post-mortem that definitively identifies the cause of the sheep's death in the first place. So there are all these problems with verification that mean that compensation after the event is not a particularly good system, and it doesn't actually build tolerance for predators in those compensated communities. But it's the thing that people feel instinctively drawn to. And it may be, there's lots of maybes in this, but it may be that if we do manage to reintroduce lynx in Scotland, it may be that that is what farmers demand, that is what they want. But we know that the alternative, these sort of payment systems, they do work, and they are used in some other countries. Sweden, for example, it's not per lamb, it's more just an annual payment, and it is actually based on the number of lynx or other species. They do it with other species as well, like wolverines, for example. So it's done on how many reproductions of that protected predator that society values. So the more of predators you have, the more money you earn as a community or an individual farmer. And there are various African countries that do the same thing, where they use camera traps to assess the number of predators in an area and then pay people on the back of that. So the more nature you have, and particularly the more predators you have, the more money you earn.
So, Cora, if I can come back to you, just reflecting on those various different options that Hugh's talked about there. The first was, it's at the behest of the farmer. It's an extra burden on the farmer, the idea of the predator-friendly products. But at the same time, if they were marketed and a lot of more regenerative, food is sold more directly to customers. And so I can see that would, provide an added value if it was well promoted. We're talking about annual maintenance payments from the public purse. So because of the fact that we know that is an imposition on the farmer, there is a payment from the government to the farmer because they have agreed or are in the position of living with lynx. And then thirdly, there's a predation payment with the various challenges that Hugh outlined there. Are any of those attractive to you? And obviously, the levels, if you were suddenly to double the value of the sheep that you have on your farm through maintenance payments from the government, would that be attractive? Are there levels of payments that would make you more open to the idea of having lynx in the landscape? I wonder how you reflect on these various different subjects.
First off, I think it's really important to say that I think it's incredibly difficult to even put a value on a breeding hill ewe, for all of the reasons that I've mentioned earlier of the public good and the ecological value that sheep can deliver. But also, in my mind, the breeding of a hill sheep is irreplaceable, and it takes years of careful management and breeding. And in a system like ours, where it's an entirely pasture-grazed diet, the sheep are outside 365 days of the year. They lamb outside unassisted, and they aren't relying on medicines or antibiotics. That is a real, animal health and welfare is of the utmost priority. But when we're seeing more ongoing concern of disease coming in from other countries, I think that we really have to protect and ring fence these resilient and robust livestock animals who are not reliant on medicines or antibiotics for basically global food security, and also for, you know, for human well-being and the role that this meat can play in a healthy, varied diet. I think when we've got 1 in 10 school children, 1/4 of women, and over half of teenage girls are low in iron, and we know that grass-fed meat is if you choose to eat it, is a sustainable source full of iron, protein, and omega-3 and 6, we cannot underestimate the public health value, and also the public health value, for example, with utilising sheep in bracken management and suppression, when we know that bracken can be a smother of biodiversity and harbours ticks, and Lyme disease is obviously a concern for the NHS. And I just think that we have so many issues in our society right now that I don't have confidence that there even are the funds to begin to start considering what they would look like. Like I've said before, I just think at the moment there's so much broken and so much to fix that I really don't understand where these funds would come from.
Aside from where the funds are, though, and let me just check back with you, because obviously what Cora says there in terms of, you know, the value of a hill ewe, you know, where that epigenetics has been built up over a number of generations, where that ability to lamb in particular ways, that the hefting that, you know, has sort of taken place, where, you know, the sheep know where they're supposed to be and they're comfortable in those environments. Obviously that is quite difficult to value. Are there examples of ewes being taken by lynx, or is it lambs that we're talking about, just as a point of information?
It is mostly lambs, but it is possibly ewes as well. And just this idea that a hefted ewe with all of this sort of generations of breeding built into it is effectively invaluable. I think we have to be really careful about that. Like, fully recognize the value of these animals and how complex and far beyond its basic sort of market cost that value goes. But that is also true of livestock in other countries, that you will find hill shepherds in the Alps that feel exactly the same about their sheep, and yet they are coexisting with predators. That is the norm in most other countries. So yes, these animals are valuable, but we're talking about relatively small numbers that are ever likely to be predated. And we have to say, are these animals so valuable that we cannot have our native wildlife because we have to protect these livestock at all costs?
I don't think it was so much that they were invaluable. It was more that it's difficult to set a value, and I think, you know, that's a slightly different point. And I hear what you're saying there, Hugh, about, you know, the way that these animals are coexisting in other countries. But just to come back to that really basic sort of heart of that question, Cora, do you think, I mean, aside from whether the funds are physically available or not, if the funds were available, can you imagine that there is a price that's set by the public that would make you feel more comfortable about making the changes that were necessary for you as a farmer in your farm system of kind of embracing the reintroduction of lynx?
I mean, obviously neither of us are in control of policy, so we don't know what the future will look like. But at the moment, there is no financial price that you could put on this to make me feel comfortable. And I also think you've got varied levels of predation in different countries across Europe for lynx. So it is really hard to gauge what the predation outcomes would be in Scotland, because you've got Norway where it's really high, you've got other countries where it's slightly lower, but also they have other food sources, like I'm not entirely, is it the chamois? I can't pronounce it properly.
the chamois, yeah.
Yeah, the chamois. So we don't have, which is another huge part of the lynx diet, and we've seen that. And I think it was I read an example of in Durand, France, where lambs and ewes were being predated upon, yet there were roe deer present, but the lynx had intentionally gone for the ewes and lambs. And I just think that ultimately lynx is a wild animal, and like us all, will take the easiest route for survival. And I think that at the moment we live in such times of global insecurity that no one is entirely sure of what the future holds and what wild animals might do. And I think of an example, and I understand that this isn't lynx, but for an example, during lockdown, when the public bins were all closed, we had such high levels of seagulls on our farm that we had never seen before and have never seen since. And I witnessed seagulls working together to attack and kill a live lamb, which they were obviously doing for survival, and it was a really unique set of circumstances. But no one ever thought that public bins would be closed, and there was a knock-on effect which was felt on our hill farm, which is far away from the coast. Really, so I just think it's so, nature's amazing, and nature will do its utmost to survive and the best that it can do. And we're living in times of such insecurity. We cannot presume how this potentially could play out, because we just do not know.
Cora also mentioned control, and presumably lethal control, as part of that, Hugh. How do other countries deal with that issue?
It varies from country to country. And Cora mentioned Switzerland before, talking about her worry that lynx will just take the easiest prey that are available, and that in Switzerland they do have chamois and roe deer, and yet lynx do still attack sheep, and that's 100% right. It is not the case that if you have natural prey available, lynx will never attack sheep. I don't want to give that impression. But the numbers of sheep that are killed in Switzerland, she talked about the Jura Mountains for that study where lynx had been killing some livestock. The average number of sheep that is killed in the Jura Mountains is between 20 and 50 sheep a year by all of the lynx that live in the Jura Mountains. So most of the lynx, most of the time, they are killing roe deer and chamois. It's just that sometimes, very occasionally, you will get one lynx that maybe takes. We heard about an instance when we visited Switzerland last year with some farmers. We heard about an instance where a lynx did go into a barn and it took 5 lambs. So you get these instances where it can happen, but they are relatively few and far between. And I want to be very clear that the lynx's preferred prey is roe deer, and that when we know of accounts of a female lynx that has raised kittens in a den in areas surrounded by sheep, hundreds and hundreds of sheep all around within a few hundred meters of this lynx den site. And this female lynx who had a collar on, she was recorded making an over 10-kilometer commute every night to go and hunt roe deer and hares. So they do have a very strong preference for natural prey, but that does not mean that you will never get sheep taken.
And if you do have a rogue animal, as they're sometimes called, an animal that takes a lamb and
for
comes
lethal
back.
control.
Because presumably they're going to be licensed, and farmers won't just be, enabled to go out and shoot any that they fancy. No. And so how does that work?
Yeah, how they manage it in Switzerland is that if you have an instance, or to be more precise, multiple instances, if lynx are responsible for more than 15 sheep in a year, killing more than 15 sheep in a year, and that is within a 5-kilometer radius, or if an individual lynx is linked to the deaths of more than 15 sheep. So if they've got camera trap footage set up at the carcasses of these sheep, and they can say, no, this lynx has definitely killed more than 15 sheep this year. If that happens, and if a number of other criteria are met, so they have to check that A, they believe that no other option exists except for lethal control. B, they have to check that they believe that lethal control of that lynx will not have a critical impact on the health of the overall population of the predator in Switzerland. And C, they want to check that the livestock owner has taken reasonable measures to protect their livestock in the first place. But if all those 3 criteria are met, and if the lynx has killed more than 15 sheep, or if sheep have been killed the year before, that threshold comes down, so it comes down to 12 sheep, then a ranger, a wildlife warden, will be sanctioned to go and shoot that lynx, and that has happened. There was a spate of livestock attacks around the turn of the millennium where deer numbers crashed in Switzerland. There were a series of harsh winters, and they did see an uptick in livestock attacks up from that sort of background level I talked about, from about 20 to 50 sheep losses per year. It rose up to about 200 sheep losses per year for a brief period. And they killed, I think, 6 lynx at that time that were officially killed. It's suspected that there might have been some illegally killed at that time as well. But since then, there has not been any occasion where a lynx has had to be killed, because none of them have crossed that threshold of killing sheep often enough. It's that rare. So I think Cora did reference this earlier about how farmers feel like they don't have any control over this issue of when predation happens, and their livestock are vulnerable to predators. And I think in countries where they have a healthy relationship with a healthy population of predators, it is often the case that there are systems in place whereby if that predation level crosses a certain level and becomes intolerable, then you have to recognize that and you have to look after the farmer's interests. But it's about where you set that threshold and how you manage that. It can't be, as some of the farmers on our trip felt, that if a lynx killed a single sheep, that was going to be grounds for killing that lynx. That it just isn't sustainable. So it's a tricky balancing act. But I think the fairest solution for all parties, and the one where you can maintain coexistence with a healthy level of predators and a healthy farming sector, is where you do accept that lethal control is necessary in some circumstances.
Both of you, I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate that we're going, substantially over time. But I think this is an important conversation, and it's really interesting hearing what you have to say. Just moving on from that issue of control, one of the things that you mentioned there was the way that that lynx, have collars, and I think that the assumption is that the lynx would have collars, and these would be electronic tags that we would know where those lynx were at any given time. We're able to track them, and I wonder, Hugh, if you could just talk a bit about the way that that a flock might be protected, whether those are using that technology, the tagging that we've talked about there, or whether it's the other more sort of pastoral type approaches where there is round the clock shepherding. How could farmers protect their flocks?
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned that the lynx would have collars, and obviously that helps researchers keep track of where they are. But if we were in a situation where lynx were reintroduced, the first animals to be reintroduced would certainly be collared, but it's not going to be the case that the entire population is collared indefinitely. So we shouldn't pretend that we're always going to know where every lynx is. That's not going to be the case. So there's a spectrum of protection measures that you can put in place. As I mentioned earlier, probably the most important one is just keeping sheep and lynx and as far apart as possible. And the most effective way you simply do that is just fencing. If you keep sheep fenced into fields or outside of forests at least, then the risk is much reduced. If you then still do have a problem with predation, as can happen, and we know that there are these sort of strange hotspots that we don't fully understand what all the factors that feed into it, but sometimes these hotspots emerge where, for whatever reason, there are localized spikes in predation. There are other options you can do. So some countries use livestock guardian animals of one sort or another. Dogs are quite popular, but there are issues with dogs as well. An alternative is to use animals like llamas. They talk about guard llamas or donkeys, which are very effective at deterring lynx, not very effective against wolves, but this isn't a conversation about wolves. So you can use those animals, and people find them less scary than dogs in Scotland, where you have issues with right to roam and dog walkers, for example. And then you can also, it's important to respond to attacks. So one of the risk factors that we know that increases the risk of another attack on your sheep is having had one attack in the first place. The risk of a subsequent attack is really elevated in the sort of 4 to 6 weeks after you've had one attack. It's quite likely that you might have another one. So it's really worthwhile to invest in short-term measures, things like fox lights, deterrence. It might be that you could have some countries employ volunteer patrols. There are organisations in the Alps where volunteers go out and patrol at night, and it's quite likely that a similar system could be set up in Scotland. And if you can maintain those measures over a short term in that high risk period, it can significantly decrease the risk of having a habitual livestock killer on your hands, and hopefully reduce it to a one-off attack.
Cora, you've been sitting there very patiently listening to the conversation with Hugh. Do you feel convinced? Do you feel more open to the idea of lynx reintroductions as a result of the conversation, or are you just as skeptical? Are there particular things that you'd like to come back on?
To be honest, I'm just as skeptical. I'll say that again. Sorry. To be honest, I am just as skeptical, and I think that there'll be unintended consequences of some of these measures which we can put in place, and issues which we're already facing in Scotland at the moment. I mean, we're already on our second extreme wildfire risk of the year. So excluding stock from nearby forestry, I actually think it's really important that we continue to graze up to the boundary of forestry for wildfire mitigation, which, you know, we've seen the effects of that this year. So I do think that we could potentially be looking at knock-on negative effects of, you know, excluding stock on hills where there's a forestry boundary, because if you're within 30 metres of that forestry, there's a chance of a lynx attack. But then we're seeing this increased wildfire risk in Scotland. So for me, I think there could just be so many negative knock-on effects that we've not fully understood, but also any kind of payment or mitigation plan that's put into place, it takes time. And I would always argue that they should actually be in place first before the introduction of anything. And we already don't have legislation in this country to deal with apex predators who are causing problems. You know, there's so much groundwork, I think, that needs to be done in advance of anything actually happening, so that we're not feeling the unintended consequences and we don't make anything worse than it already is. And I think there's so much just now that needs fixed, that we need to focus on getting the basics and the ground level in the best possible condition and the best set up that we can.
Or are there things that you've heard from Hugh that that you found more interesting than others, I suppose, in terms of convincing you? Are there areas where you think actually that Hugh would do well to go away and do more research into a particular area, because that might help to convince you? I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but this is kind of, are there things that you think that Hugh could do in order to better convince you and farmers like you? Or is it just, you know, it's a no from you and let's talk about something else?
I think that the conversation, regardless of our personal views, is a very important one to have. And I think ultimately what I'm taking from today's conversation is you and I both want what we feel is the best thing for Scotland. We have different ways of how we think it can be achieved, but ultimately I'm wanting the best possible from my view, and you're wanting the best possible from your view. And I think it's really important that we have these constructive, amenable ways of conversing, rather than this kind of barrier of us and them. And although, no, I'm not convinced on lynx reintroduction in Scotland, I feel that we can still have a constructive and polite conversation around that. And it's really important to have these and have more of them, because ultimately, like I say, we both want what we think is the best outcome for Scotland. We have different ways of how we think that will be achieved. So for me, I think I found the whole thing interesting, and although I'm not convinced, I think it's a great example of how there can be constructive conversation, and it's really important to have open channels of communication.
And Hugh, what do you take away from the conversation?
I mean, I can't improve on Cora's endorsement of the conversation. I agree wholeheartedly. We have to keep talking and sharing our respective concerns about the future and why we believe the things we do. what do I take away? I guess a lot of Cora's concern to me, it sounds like she's really worried about where we are now, entirely fairly. We're not in a good place. But I guess where we differ is that Cora, I don't think I'm putting words in her mouth, seems to be more inclined to sort of hunkering down with what we've got. Let's try and protect what we've got, and let's not take any risks that could make things worse. Whereas what I believe is that we could have it so much better, and that yes, of course, we won't know all of the answers about all of the impacts of links, both positive and negative, until we do it. But that can't be a reason for not doing it, because that's just life, and that there is so much to be potentially gained from a links reintroduction, that I think that is something that we have to continue to explore.
It seems to me that there are many steps on the road towards a lynx reintroduction or not. And probably those steps along that road are things that you both might agree on, around the types of habitat, around improving nature and ecology, in better integrating the way that commercial businesses operate and integrate nature within them. And even if that sort of, for you, Hugh, that ultimate sort of goal of having the lynx reintroduced, even if that isn't achieved in the short to medium, even the long term, there are presumably steps along the way where a better collaboration between your organisation, Scotland the Big Picture, and yourself and Cora and other sheep farmers would be really beneficial, where that conversation could really help. Cora, is that something that you would agree with?
Yes, I do. I think that we collectively all need to find a way of constructive communication, and we need to open up more dialogue and more channels of communicating.
And just finally, Hugh?
Yeah, we need to keep talking. I don't know what to say beyond that. I mean, I think actually you talked about next steps. I think one of the next steps that's really important is this process of consultation that is increasingly. We've had a national consultation last year where we talked to representatives from national organisations about what their concerns are, and the Links to Scotland partnership is now moving towards more local consultations, and I think that will be a really useful forum to explore some of the issues that Cora raised. Things like, well, how do we manage wildfire risk if we sort of have limitations on where we can graze animals near to woodland? And it's only farmers that have the in-depth understanding of how and where and when they manage livestock that can really sort of help us to thrash out these issues. But it is my belief that they can be thrashed out. You can find a solution to these things, and you can talk about sort of when are the risks of predation from lynx higher or lower in the year, which sorts of livestock are more or less at risk. There are all these things that can help you to figure out, okay, this is how we can keep the grazing to continue where we need it to happen, and where we can still manage predation risk at an acceptable level. So that's why it's so important that we talk, because we can share the relative knowledge that we have, the respective knowledge on these things.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, both. This, I think, has been pretty much the longest Farmgate podcast we've ever done, which illustrates that, they are challenging subjects, that, these are contentious things that we're talking about, and trying to sort of manage those conversations. It's not easy. It's been so interesting. Thank you both for being so respectful of each other. And I think that's been, really critical within this. And hopefully, the way that we've had this conversation is the tone that, these conversations will continue with at local level, as you've said there, Hugh, with that consultation. But that is all we have time for. We better stop. But we'll be back next week. And in the meantime, please do take a moment to check out Farmgate Leaders and our Filling the Funding Gap series. For now, I'd like to thank my guests, Cora Cooper from Tardo's Farm in Ayrshire, and Hugh Webster from Scotland, The Big Picture. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now.